AWS B5.2, an American national standard, specification for the training, qualification, and company certification of welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistants. Abstract. This specification defines the requirements and program for an employed company to train, qualify, and company certified welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistants to contract or industry specific inspector standards. The program is developed as a written practice and controlled by an employer. The qualification requires documentation of experience, training, and a satisfactory completion of an examination. The examination tests knowledge of welding processes, welding procedures, welder qualification, destructive testing, non-destructive testing, terms, definitions, symbols, reports, records, safety and responsibility. Forward, this is the second edition of AWSB 5.2. The first edition was published in 2001. Revisions in this edition were made to Clause 1, Scope 7, Written Practices, 8, Physical Requirements, 9, Training, 10, Examination and Requirements, and 11, Certification. The title of the standard has been revised to better reflect its scope. The changes are widespread enough that clear markup of the changes is difficult. The first edition of AWS B 5.2 superseded QC 293 recommended practice for the training, qualification, and certification of welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistant. AWS B5.2 provides the framework for an in-house certification program and written practices for welding inspectors. To differentiate it from the central certification program of AWS supported by the AWS B5.1 and QC1 standards, B5.2 uses the nomenclature welding inspector specialist. The specification for the qualification of welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistant was developed to provide a qualification basis with the defined minimum requirements for welding inspector specialist to demonstrate competence through a combination of education, experience, and examination. Scope. This specification established the minimum requirements for an employer's company's internal written practice for the training, qualification, and that company's certification of welding inspector specialists and welding inspector assistants. The employer is responsible for the testing, examination, and qualification of their inspectors. This specification is to aid employees in identifying the basic factors in qualifying personnel performing welding inspection for a specific company or project. In developing the written practice, Clause 7, the employer shall review the detailed recommendations presented herein and incorporate them into the practice as applicable. Examination and certification by the American Welding Society (AWS) shall not be requirement for the welding inspector specialist, nor is there reciprocity between a welding inspector specialist or welding inspector assistant and AWS certified welding inspector CWI or certified associate welding inspector CAW in accordance with AWS QC1 specification for AWS certification of welding inspectors. Safety and health issues and concerns are beyond the scope of this standard and reference therefore are not addressed herein. Safety and health information is available from the following resources: American Welding Society, AWS ANSI Z4 9.1, Safety in Welding, Cutting and Allied Processes, AWS Safety and Health Fact Sheets, other safety and health information on the AWS website. material or equipment manufacturers, safety data sheets supplied by the materials manufacturers, operating manuals supplied by the equipment manufacturers, applicable regulatory agencies. Work performed in accordance with this standard may involve the use of materials that have been deemed hazardous and may involve operations or equipment that may cause injury or death. This standard does not purpose to address all safety and health risks that may be encountered. The user of this standard should establish an appropriate safety program to address such risks as well as to meet applicable regulatory requirements. ANSI 49.1 should be considered when developing the safety program. References. Normative references. The following documents are referenced with his publications and are mandatory to the extent specified herein. For undated references, the latest edition of the reference standards shall apply. For dated references, subsequent amendments to or revisions of any of these publications do not apply. ANSI Z49.1 Safety in Welding, Cutting and Allied Processes. AWS A3.0 MR A3.0 Standard welding terms and definitions including terms for adhesive bonding, brazing, soldering, thermal cutting and thermal spraying. AWS A2.4 Standard symbols for welding, brazing and non-destructive examination. AWS B5.1 Specification for Qualification of Welding Inspectors. Informative references. AWS QC1 Specification for AWS Certification of Welding Inspectors. Brazing Handbook AWS. Welding Handbooks Volume 1 to 4 AWS. Welding Inspection Handbook AWS. Terms and definitions. For the purpose of this document, the following terms and definitions apply. Certification, the act of determining, verifying and attesting in written to the qualification of personnel or organizations in accordance with specified requirements. Certifying officials, the employee of the company who is designated to certify inspectors and revoke certification. Employer company, the corporate, private or public entity with employees, personnel for wages, salary, fees or other considerations. Qualification, demonstrated training, skill, knowledge and experience required for personnel to perform the duties of a specific job or function, typically demonstrated by passing a performance test. Specification, document stating requirements. Training, an organized program developed to impart the knowledge and skills necessary for qualification. Written practice, a document to specify methods, requirements, examination records, certifying official. It is for a company's welding inspection personnel certification program. Level of qualification. There are two levels of welding inspector qualification defined in this document. These are welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistant. Welding inspector specialist. A welding inspector specialist is an individual who has been qualified by the employer as meeting the requirements of the employer's welding inspector qualification program. Welding inspector assistant. A welding inspector assistant is an individual who has been qualified by the employer as meeting the requirements of the employer's program to assist the welding inspector specialist in performing the defined duties. The welding inspector assistant shall perform inspection duties under the supervision of a welding inspector specialist. Functions. In establishing a program, the employer shall state in written practice the specific functions to be carried out by the inspectors. As a minimum, the item in Annex A there are applicable to the company's operations shall be operated into the written practice. The company's methods for accomplishing each duty shall be defined. The specific functions of the welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistant shall be defined in the written practice. Annex A, body of knowledge. A1, introduction. A1.1, capabilities. Judges quality. Interpret specification limitations and intent. Communicate results and make reports to supervisor. A1.2, qualifications. Physical condition, vision, knowledge of welding, knowledge of drawings, specifications, specific codes and procedures used by employer, knowledge of testing methods, experience, education and training. A 1.3, responsibilities, general, specific company responsibilities, personnel and company safety practices. A2, welding, cutting and brazing processes, processes used in fabricating the product being inspected, overview of each process, discontinuities that may be encountered with each process. A3, material fundamentals, weldability, metallurgy, chemistry, mechanical, tensile strength, hardness and toughness, testing for mechanical properties, metallographic tests. A4, fabrication, joint preparation, joint fit up, welding procedure specification, welder qualification, other fabrication documents. A5, heat treatment, preheat, interpass temperature, post weld heat treatment PWHT. A6, non destructive examination. 1, visual inspection, application and acceptance standards, tools and their use. 2, liquid penetrant testing, procedures, acceptance standards. 3, magnetic particle testing, acceptance standards, procedures. 4, other testing and inspection, 100% sampling, rending sampling, radiographic, ultrasonic. 5, specific accompanying procedures. A7, inspection documentation, verify dimensions, verify written welding procedures, verify welder qualification papers, review NDE reports, prepare narrative reports. A8, references. ANSI Z49.1, safety in welding, cutting and allied processes, brazing handbook AWS, welding handbooks volume 1 to 4 AWS, welding inspection AWS, AWS A3.0M or A3.0, standard welding terms and definitions, including terms for adhesive bonding, brazing, soldering, thermal cutting and thermal spraying. AWS A2.4, standard symbols for welding, brazing and non-destructive examination. Education and experience. The following are minimum requirements for each candidate for welding inspector specialist. The candidate shall be a high school graduate or hold an approval general equivalency diploma. As an alternative to the requirements in 6.1.1, the employer may accept additional years of experience in lieu of the education requirements. The candidate shall have no fewer than 5 years experience in an occupational function that the direct relationship to the weldments being fabricated to specified code or other standard or contract, and shall be directly involved in one or more of the following situations: design preparation for plans and drawing for weldment construction, production, Planning and control of welding operations such as procedures, equipment, materials, or personnel involved in weldment fabrication. Construction, performance of welder, fitter, or other functions in fabrication or erection of weldments. Inspection, detecting and measurement of weld discontinuities or verification of fabrication requirements. Repair of weldment. An alternative to the requirements in 6.1.2, the employer may substitute an equal number of years of post-high school education for required years of experience provided the studies are directly related to the functions defined in 6.1.2. Post-high school education is defined as any of the following: associate or higher degree in engineering technology, physics, or science. Engineering technical ed school courses successfully completed in a curriculum that can be applied to one above. Trade vocational school courses in curriculum related to welding. The certificate shall submit written documentation that he/she meets the requirements of 6.1.1 and 6.1.2 or the alternatives listed in 6.1.2.1. The following are minimum requirements of each candidate for welding inspector assistant. The candidate shall be a school graduate or hold a state or military approved high school equivalency diploma, e.g., GED. As an alternative to the requirements in 6.2.1, the employer may accept additional years of experience in lieu of the educational requirements. The candidate shall have at least 6 months experience in an occupational function that has a direct relationship to weldments fabricated to a code or other standard. See 6.1.2. Written practice. The employer shall establish a written practice that details the job function for welding inspectors, or the employer may use more than one written practice based on specific inspection duties or products. The written practice shall also describe the education, experience, and training required for company certification. A sample outline for recommended practice is included as Annex B. The written practice shall include topics, subjects, and training related to the inspection of weldments fabricated to a code, specification, or other standard as applied by the employer. The written practice shall define the company official who is authorized to certify inspectors and revoke certification. Physical requirements. Candidates must be physically able to safely perform the activities as required or specified by the employer. The functions to be performed by an inspector are defined in the employer's written practice. Vision. Near vision acuity. The welding inspector specialist or welding inspector assistant shall be tested for near vision acuity. The welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistant shall have ability to read Jaguar number 2 letters or smaller at a minimum distance of 12 inches or equivalent test with at least one eye with or without correction. The welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistant shall be retested for visual acuity every 3 years. Color perception. The welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistant should take a color perception test. Note: near vision acuity is considered essential to the proper performance of welding examination. Failure to meet the above level of visual acuity shall be failure to meet the requirements of this specification. Color perception is described in some specific application but is not considered essential for all examination. It shall be the employer's responsibility to establish and enforce visual performance requirements for its welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistants. Training. Candidates to be considered for qualification and certification shall have received sufficient training to become thoroughly familiar with the principle of welding inspection applicable to the practice to be used and the products to be inspected. Training shall include the specification standards or contract requirements applicable to the inspections being performed. It is the employer's responsibility to determine the extent of the content and minimum number of hours of training required for a welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistant. Training requirements shall be written into the company's written practice. Training shall also address safety considerations and the proper care and use of tools and equipment when used. A recommended body of knowledge is provided in Annex A. Examination requirements. Proficiency examination. The employer shall conduct initial examination for new candidates and periodic updates for previously qualified inspectors. The examination shall incorporate checkpoints or proficiency demonstration to verify that the individuals possess the ability to perform specific inspection and interpret results. Verification that the candidates met the minimum requirements of these standards shall be a permanent part of the employee's records. Welding inspector specialist examination. The employer shall structure a test consisting of 3 parts as defined below. Candidates shall achieve a minimum passing score as determined by the employer for each of the 3 parts. A minimum passing score of 70% or higher for each of 3 parts in required. The recommended examination shall consist of an open book test on industry standards or contracts applicable to the employer, closed book test on welding fundamentals including safety, and on practical application of welding inspection. See Annex for recommended body of knowledge. Written welding assistant examination. The employer shall structure a test consisting of 3 parts as are defined below. Candidates shall achieve minimum passing score as demonstrated by the employer for each of the 3 tests. A minimum passing score of 70% or higher for each of 3 parts is required. The recommended examination shall of an open book test on industry standards or contracts applicable to the employer, closed book test on welding fundamentals including safety, and a test from practical applications of welding inspection. See Annex A for recommended body of knowledge. Third party agencies. At the options of the employer, an outside agency may be engaged to provide assistance in trainings, qualification, and examination services. In such instances, the employer is responsible to ensure that training, qualification, and examination requirements are in accordance with this document. Certification. It is the employer's responsibility to certify the welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistant meet the requirements of the company's written practice. Course outlines and certification records shall be maintained on file by employer and shall contain records of the certified individual and copies of written practices as required by Clause 7. These records shall be maintained during the times of inspectors are certified and for 3 years after the termination of the employee. These records shall contain as a minimum the following: name of certified individual, statement indicating experience and completion of training in accordance with employer's written practice, verification that individual met the requirement described in clause 8, 9 and 10, including copies of applicable education and experience certificate, VLOQT records and test records, signature of certifying officials, dates of certification. Company responsibilities. Code of ethics, responsibility to the public, conflict of interest, unauthorized practice, revocation of certification, reinstatement, recertification and termination shall be in accordance with the employer's written practice. Note: while the welding inspector specialist and welding inspector assistant have established credentials, company certification alone may not legally qualify the inspector to provide inspection service to the public. Building codes and regulations, contract documents, and other project specifications may require that inspection to be performed by or under the direction of others, such as qualified third party agency, a qualified professional engineer, or a welding inspector qualified to AWS B5.1 and certified in accordance with AWS QC1. According to the Annex A affirmative, following is a list of AWS documents on qualification and certification. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, share and subscribe.